I will just request everybody to keep their mics in mute. Can we control it? Sanaya from here.
I just did.
Wonderful, thank you.
Go ahead, Sanaya.
Mamta, I think the screen is not right. It's in front of the presentation. It's not a full screen.
Yeah, I think
expand the window.
Aditya has shared his screen. So
What should I do, sorry?
could you just stop sharing for a minute and then reshare again?
Sure.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this talk at Kamla Raheja Institute. Today's talk is on resilience reset, creating resilient cities in the global south. Our speaker is Dr. Aditya Bahadur. I'll just be briefly introducing him. Dr. Bahadur is a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development at London, UK. Previously, he served as a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, and prior to that, with Oxford Policy Management. He has 15 years of experience in research, evaluation, and practice of DRR, climate change, urbanism, and development. He has published widely on these topics, including highly regarded academic journals. His work has been cited by the IPCC and has informed the UK government's approach to disaster resilience. He has served as the research coordinator of the BRACED program, one of the world's largest community-level resilience building initiatives, running in 9 countries. He has completed his MA and PhD in development studies from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex in UK. He has completed his postdoctoral research as a Fulbright Fellow at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, New York, where he wrote a book on urbanization and resilience. Welcome, Dr. Bahadur. I'm turning the floor over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sanaya, for that kind introduction, and to your institution for asking me to speak today. It's a real privilege and honor to be with all of you today. I'm just going to share my screen and hoping that Sanaya, you can confirm if it's appropriate, if it's appearing
yes, it's
properly.
Visible. Please go ahead.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful, great. So yes, it's a great honor to be amongst all of you today. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll present the key arguments from my book, Resilience Reset, Creating Resilient Cities in the Global South. Because I want to leave enough time for questions and answers at the end, I'm going to jump straight into it. Just before I begin, by way of a background, there were 2 driving imperatives for me and my co-author, Tom Tanner, to write this book. The first was the rapid expansion of urban areas. Now, every single piece of writing that you would read on urbanization these days begins with the same sentence, that for the first time in the history of the world, most of the world is now living in towns and cities as opposed to rural areas. I think what is less well understood is how quickly we're going to go from roughly 55% urbanization to 70% urbanization over the next 3 decades. But crucially, urbanization is fastest in some of the world's most vulnerable, marginalized, poor areas. In sub-Saharan Africa, rates of urbanization are just over 4%. In South Asia, they're over 2%. So the world is urbanizing very rapidly. So that was the first driving imperative. The second imperative was the intensification of climate risks across the world's urban areas. Now, the book uses the standard framing of climate risk, which is a component of 3 things: a hazard, such as a cyclone or a flood, or an event or a shock or stress. And we can see that across the world, most large urban agglomerations, according to the IPCC, will experience 1.5 degree temperature rise over the next 10 to 20 years. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but I always like to say that think about it in the context of the human body. When you get a fever and your temperature rises by 1.5 degrees, you have to take rapid measures to bring it down. Slightly crude analogy, but I hope I've made the point that even 1.5-degree temperature rise is very important. Rainfall is intensifying across cities in the world, and many cities are facing water scarcity. The interesting thing is the paradigmatic changes in the risk that cities face, and sometimes are a dichotomous risk. So, for instance, many cities will face water scarcity, but also flood risk across cities is increasing. According to one analysis conducted a couple of years ago, the amount of urban area exposed to flood risk will rise by 250% between the year 2000 and the year 2050. So rapid intensification of hazards. The second component of climate risk is exposure. And by 2030, 75% of everyone living in a city will be living along the coast. 2/3 of all urban citizens living in large cities are living in low-lying areas that are highly prone to different kinds of hazards, such as flooding, sea level rise, etc. Now, the third element of climate risk is vulnerability, or the innate inability of people to withstand shocks and stresses. And I think there's a high amount of vulnerability in urban areas. Almost 1 billion people across the world, cities, live in informal settlements and have poor access to healthcare, education, financial safety nets, and also suffer massive deficits in governance and accountability. And of these, 750 million roughly earn less than $1 a day, which means that they have very little innate ability to bounce back from shocks and stresses. They have no financial safety nets on which they can rely when disasters strike. And that is why in this book, we reviewed this global state of play on how people are trying to build urban resilience. And we identify 5 shifts that need to take place. The first is we argue that we need to understand how climate change is impacting cities, but we need to pivot from the current emphasis on traditional approaches for understanding climate impact in cities to more innovative approaches that I'll talk about in the first component of my presentation. The second component deals with working with communities. And now in this, we argue that the current state of play is typified by incremental action to make vulnerable communities more resilient, whereas we need to switch towards more transformational approaches. The third component will deal with the vitally important issue of urban planning, which I suspect all of you know more about than I do, but I will talk about how we need to make sure that we transition from the current emphasis on mainstreaming risk in formal planning instruments to embracing informality with a greater degree of earnestness. Fourth component is about the urban systems, water, energy, transport, etc. And here we argue that we need to transition from the current sharp emphasis on infrastructural development to exploring how to build capacities and capabilities of those running cities, particularly in the global south, to deal with shocks and stresses. And nothing is possible without finance. So the final bit of my presentation will talk about how to leverage the right kind of financing to enhance urban resilience. Through these 5 chapters, we hope to provide a concise yet comprehensive overview of the shifts that we need to induce in order to build resilience effectively across the global south. So I'll begin very quickly with our first chapter, which is on data. So each of these 5 components, 5 chapters follow the same format where we explore the current state of play, identify the challenges with the current state of play, and then highlight the new direction that we think is needed. Now, beginning with climate information and data. So we began by understanding how do cities currently understand different kinds of the different elements of climate risk. And we began with hazards. And hazards are typically understood through GCMs, general circulation models, or some people call them global circulation models, where you provide an input into greenhouse gas emissions, and the model spits out a rough estimation of the impact that this will have on temperature rise. And then further downstream models convert temperature rise into different kinds of hazard models. And then further downscale modeling can convert these hazard models into sectoral impact models. So for instance, you can understand through a model, what the temperature rise will be over the next couple of decades. And then from that, you can try and understand the impact that will likely to have on rainfall. And from that, you can try and extrapolate the economic impact of the changes in rainfall on agricultural productivity as a very crude estimation of how modeling works. GCMs usually work in resolutions of 300 square kilometers. To downscale further, regional climate models have been developed that provide some estimation of hazards in a grid of 50 square kilometers. And when I say hazards, I largely mean temperature rise because this is what they are mostly used for. Apart from this, satellite remote sensing is also used widely to understand hazards. You can take satellite pictures of different weather formations in coastal areas to try and understand how urban areas contiguous that lie on the coast will be impacted by these developing patterns. Different kinds of weather forecasts are also used to understand hazards that can rely on equipment on the ground or in weather balloons that try and map temperature, humidity, air pressure, etc., to try and extrapolate what this means for upcoming hazards. In some outlying circumstances, initiatives have also relied on people's perception of climate hazards. I was part of a really interesting survey in Nepal, which surveyed 5,000 households across the country, basically asking people what are the hazards that they faced. And this threw up some really counterintuitive insights. For instance, this survey said that the biggest impact that people face in Nepal is windstorms. And I've been working in the context of Nepal for almost 12 years. And Nepal has a very crowded constellation of adaptation programs and policies. Not a single one of them deals with windstorms. So these bottom-up perception-based surveys can sometimes throw up really interesting results. The second component of climate risk is exposure. And again, you can use satellite remote sensing, satellite pictures to see who's exposed to what kind of hazard. So for instance, you can use satellite pictures to map elevation, and then elevation can provide an estimate of who might be exposed to floods in a particular area. Census surveys are also useful in certain circumstances. The Census of India, provides an estimate of who lives where. So once you know that a cyclone is about to hit X district of Odisha, you can crack open the 2011 census and try and map from that who all live in which of these areas to try and develop an understanding of how many people are exposed. And then there are other bottom-up methods such as participatory mapping approaches that you can undertake with communities to understand who lives where, who's exposed to what kind of risk. And the final component of climate risk is vulnerability. And again, a few different methods are used here currently. Satellite remote sensing, again, is used to map vulnerability. Very broadly, you can develop, you can understand the socioeconomic characteristics of a particular neighborhood or a particular part of a city using satellite pictures by looking at the quality of roofs, the quality of roads, the density of settlement patterns, and that can be used as a proxy of vulnerability. Certain censuses, like the Census of India, has a rich inventory of household level assets, household income, caste backgrounds that again can be used as a proxy of vulnerability. And household surveys like the National Family Health Survey also includes data that you can use to understand how vulnerable a particular household might be to different kinds of climate-induced shocks and stresses. But in the context of international development, which is the area in which I operate, participatory methods are used widely to understand vulnerability through group discussions, participatory rural appraisal type approaches. So this is the current state of play. We then reviewed all the challenges with these existing approaches of understanding climate impacts and climate risk in cities. And we found that they fall into three buckets. Broadly, there are problems of certainty, granularity, and veracity across these different methods that we've talked about. Climate projections that we talked about that emanate from climate models are delivered largely in wide ranges. So it's very difficult to know that in Chembur, the temperature will rise by 0.75 degrees in the year 2031 in July. What you will get to know is across the South Asian landmass, temperatures will rise by between 1.5 to 3 degrees. So it's very difficult to get precise outcomes from these projections, even from RCMs. And climate models are very bad at predicting extreme events. And this is for a number of reasons, including the fact that current climate models do not adequately appropriate cloud behavior. Cloud behavior is very important to understand extreme events. Simply put, if clouds are going to be wispy, more sunlight will go through and there'll be more global warming. If clouds are dense, then more sunlight will bounce back into space and there'll be less global warming. Understanding how wispy or dense clouds are in different parts of the world is a very difficult science, and these models are unable to do that at the moment. As an example of the problems of certainty with them. And then there are problems of granularity. There are different kinds of problems here. In satellite pictures, you can look at a small area for a small amount of time, or a large area at a crude resolution for a longer period of time. So there are these trade-offs there. And then also, while certain censuses like that of India are pretty good, certain other censuses, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they don't deliver insights at scale. There, the census operates in grids of 10,000 square kilometers that are not useful for aiding decision making, at least at the city scale. And finally, there are problems of veracity where there can be classification and calibration errors. Again, you need a certain degree of technical skill to develop proxies of vulnerability from satellite pictures. Also, when running participatory approaches, you need to have a high degree of training for the person who's delivering these trainings to ensure that it's not polluted by their own worldviews and their own biases. Now, you might say, thanks for telling us all the challenges with climate information, but what does this have to do with cities? So we tease out the specific challenges that urban areas throw up to these existing approaches of understanding climate risk. And very simply put, we argue that urban areas are more dynamic, complex, dense, and diverse than non-urban areas. And each of these pillars of urbanization poses particular challenges for understanding climate risk. When it comes to dynamism, there are rapid changes in the urban built environment, which makes it difficult for RCMs to appropriate these changes to deliver an adequate picture of what temperatures might be, because these depend on urban geomorphologies, urban canyon effects, etc., that these models are unable to appropriate. Same problem with complexity, that urban land use patterns vary from block to block, from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, and therefore cities have urban microclimates, which makes it very difficult to extrapolate from regional trends what the climate in a city might be. Cities are more dense, which makes it more difficult to ascertain exposure. So for instance, you can take a satellite picture of a slum. Now, unless that satellite picture is of extremely high resolution, it's difficult to really tell where one slum settlement, where one household finishes and another begins, which then makes it difficult to understand how many people might be living in a particular area. And finally, cities are very diverse. People from different geographical background, linguistic backgrounds, different castes, all live in similar areas, in the same areas, which poses a problem particularly to participatory approaches that are predicated on a degree of social homogeneity. Because they aim to generate consensus through group discussion, and that they spring from an earlier generation of participatory approaches that were used in rural areas where there is a greater degree of social homogeneity. These participatory approaches have certain challenges in urban areas and do not always deliver the right results, which then has led us to argue that we need to pivot towards a new generation of approaches to understand climate risk in cities. And we argue that we need to draw on approaches that stem from information communication technology devices and draw on big data approaches. Now, in the book, we explore a large number of examples. For now, I'm only going to give you 3 examples. Now, as you'll recall, earlier we talked about how urban microclimates, how air temperature can vary from block to block, from neighborhood to neighborhood in a city, making it very difficult to understand how a city, for instance, might be impacted by heat waves. Now, to overcome this problem, one innovative initiative in the US has basically found that every Android phone in the world is constantly monitoring its battery temperature because Android phones have a tendency to explode if the battery recharges when it's above a particular temperature. So the phone has to cut recharging off if the temperature of the battery is high. So what this initiative has done, they've through real world calibration, they've developed an algorithm that converts battery temperature data into air temperature data. And now what they're doing is crowdsourcing extremely precise air temperature readings from 500,000 mobile phones across cities in the United States, which then allows them to develop a very precise picture of how hot particular areas of a city are, and over time start to model heat waves in cities, which then has transformational consequences for heat action planning, for instance, where very soon a city may not have to deploy cooling centers across the entire city. They can target resources to particular neighborhoods that are likely to be more impacted than others. That's one example. Another example comes from Dar es Salaam, a city that suffers from repeated flooding. And what they did here was this initiative did extremely low cost, high quality drone photography that delivers basically a map of an area up to a resolution of 5 centimeters square. So you can see a 1 rupee coin lying on the ground with this kind of photography. They then convert this photography into online maps, and then they get volunteers to fan out in flood affected neighborhoods to have the community pencil in additional details. Where do old people live? Where are households with young children located? To try and determine a much more precise idea of vulnerability and exposure. And in Dar es Salaam, this has allowed the government to also do some really interesting cost-benefit analysis of developing flood protective infrastructure in low-income flood-affected neighborhoods, which has then allowed them to leverage financing from the national government for developing this flood protection infrastructure. The final example comes from East Africa, where they tried to map the vulnerability to food insecurity. Now, what they figured out was that they found a relationship between airtime recharge behavior of particular households with calorie intake. You can read about the example in detail in the book, but basically they figured out once a household is topping up the cell phone below a particular threshold amount, say whatever, $5 a month, something, at that point, they're almost certainly not consuming the right amount of calories as well. So instead of doing large and expensive household surveys that take time, they can crowdsource this information that is anonymized from cell phone providers and parachute in food aid as one illustration of the potential of big data approaches. Now, before moving on, I want to make it clear that I studied at IDS, which is the home of participatory development. So I approached this whole discussion on big data as a skeptic. So I certainly don't think it's a silver bullet. I think there are lots of challenges with it. One of the challenges being that least developed countries have extremely low internet bandwidth, posing particular challenges for these approaches. And therefore, I think that we need to meld insights from big data approaches with more traditional approaches, particularly participatory approaches and decentralized data collection approaches of the type that Slum Dwellers International has been doing for decades, where slum dwellers have been surveying themselves using standardized, structured surveys, making their problems visible to planners. And I think we need to use a bouquet of approaches, but I really think the time is right for us to selectively draw on these approaches as well. Which takes us to the second chapter, which is on engaging with vulnerable urban communities. Again, we did the same thing. We mapped the current state of play to try and understand how are people currently engaging vulnerable urban communities to try and build their resilience. And looking across hundreds of examples, we found that they fit into basically 4 or 5 key categories. Initiatives are either focused on building household level assets, so vulnerable communities have something to draw on when disasters strike, or building social capital, or increasing knowledge and awareness of climate impacts, strengthening governance and institutions in different ways of the policy environment, or finally installing local infrastructure. Now, again, I won't go through all the examples which are in the book, but I'll give you 3 quick illustrations of current approaches to work with vulnerable urban communities. A good example of this comes from Rajasthan, where the town of Dilwara was suffering from water scarcity. And one of the reasons for this was that the local water body in the town was not functioning, had fallen into disrepair because the feeder channels are full of garbage. So local NGOs got together, built a citizens community, cleaned out the local water channels, and then developed an approach to maintaining the health of the local water body, which then led to the recharge of underground aquifers and helped alleviate the problem of water scarcity in this town. Another example comes from Vietnam, where in Da Nang, which suffers from cyclones, and particularly low-income households are badly affected by cyclones because they have poor quality housing. And therefore, they held a design competition to come up with new housing designs or retrofits, and then gave out microloans to poor households to help retrofit the houses to better withstand cyclone impacts. Another example comes from Indonesia, where an initiative helped install water harvesting infrastructure at the local level to help slum neighborhoods deal with the problem of water scarcity. This just gives you a flavor of what's going on when it comes to working with vulnerable communities. Again, we found a large number of challenges with this. By and large, we found that initiatives are dealing with the proximate causes of risk as opposed to the structural causes of risk. Now we have decades of evidence that demonstrates that it is issues of governance, accountability, gender, caste, class that underpin risk as opposed to more proximate causes of risk, such as poor quality drainage, which is a cause, but only one part of the problem. Across India cities, you will find people who live on floodplains are largely those that are economically and socially and sometimes politically marginalized. So most of these initiatives ignore these underlying causes of risk to deal with, let's build a drain here, let's retrofit a house there, let's install some underground water harvesting infrastructure there, as opposed to dealing with these pernicious problems. Most of these approaches employ participatory techniques that have shown to be problematic in urban areas unless there is a high degree of technical skill attached to them. The third challenges, all of them by and large focus on the local level, whereas we now again have decades of evidence that demonstrates that if you want to have change at the city or the local or the neighborhood level, you need to work in a nested way where you're doing something at the local level, but also working at the city level, at the district level, at the state level, and at the national level. Unless you're working across scales, you're not going to have sustainable impact at scale. And of course, there are problems with scale. They're dealing with small numbers of people. And there is a challenge with sustainability, where a study has recently found that in the Pacific, for instance, 93% of all community-based adaptation and resilience measures have stopped functioning, stopped delivering impacts after donor financing has stopped. So therefore, in the book, we argue for a transition towards more transformational approaches. And we specifically identify four things. We argue that approaches must address the root causes of vulnerability or risk, these problems of power and accountability that we talked about. I was part of a remarkable initiative that was unfolding in Gorakhpur, where certain slum settlements were suffering from the problem of water logging. And this local NGO had got donor financing to solve this problem. Now, they could have gone in and helped rebuild the drains. But what they did was something much more structural. So they found that these neighborhoods were waterlogged because the drains were not functioning. The drains were not functioning because they were full of garbage. They were full of garbage because the garbage management system in these neighborhoods was not functioning. The garbage management system in these neighborhoods was not functioning because allegedly the person who got the contract for this was giving kickbacks to the local councillor and was not doing what they had been hired for. So instead of just tackling the problem of drainage, they mobilized the local community politically, put pressure on the local municipal corporation that then helped clean out the drains, provide the services that they were due, and also helped change the local municipal council in the subsequent election. We also need to ensure that initiatives are delivering lasting change that's sustainable through the development of local institutions. Initiatives need to work at scale, that means with a large number of people, but also across scales, that means in a nested way from the local to the national level. An excellent example of this is SDI that not only works from the neighborhood level to the national level, but is also federated internationally. And finally, we argue that transformational approaches must induce catalytic change, where what you do in one place must have a domino effect in another place. And an excellent example of this are self-help groups started by Seva, that started in one part of Gujarat in the 70s, soon spread to the whole state and spread to 12 other states. And in the early 2000s, the government of India, with the World Bank, started the National Livelihoods Mission, which ensures that one member of every below poverty household in the country's cities will be part of a self-help group modeled on Seva self-help groups. So this is our vision for delivering transformational change in cities. Moving to a third component, which is about formal planning. You really can't have a treatise on enhancing urban resilience without talking about planning in a meaningful way. So again, what we did was mapped the different ways in which planning instruments such as land use plans, municipal development plans, city development plans, master plans, have all been used to enhance resilience in different ways. And across these hundreds of examples, what we found was plans have helped build resilience in three ways. They influence what is built, they influence how it is built, and they influence where it is built. Now, again, I won't give you all the examples, I'll just give you three illustrative examples. As we all know, Ahmedabad suffers from the problem of extreme heat. And the city development plan that was revised and released in January 2021, if I'm not mistaken, I'm sure some of you would know this better, has an emphasis on developing green infrastructure, which helps ameliorate this risk. Plans have also influenced how things are built. The National Building Code of Bangladesh, for instance, has detailed prescriptions on the height of plinths in flood-affected areas, the type of roofs that need to be built in cyclone-affected areas, etc., etc. And plans also influence where things are built. A good example of this is in New York City, where the city basically buys out parcels of land that are highly exposed, giving people the financial ability to move to safer places. This is a flavor of what's currently going on when it comes to planning and enhancing resilience. But we argue that there are substantial challenges with this. The first challenge is, very broadly, formal planning mechanisms do not extend to the entire city. As a rule of thumb, 30% of all cities in the world are informal. People live in informal settlements, work in the informal economy, and therefore the writ of these formal planning mechanisms is limited. In certain highly vulnerable cities of the global south, this figure is almost 60%. And I clearly remember being in one of these cities with a high degree of informality and being on the 7th floor of the City Development Authority and looking at the master plan. And what was on the paper and what was outside the window was completely different, because so much of the city develops without aligning with any of these formal planning mechanisms. So by focusing sharply on formal plans as they currently stand as an entry point for mainstreaming risk, you are overlooking the fact that these plans have limited impact. The second challenge is that you're also by focusing on formal plans, you're overlooking the utility of the informal sector. The informal sector, as we all know, plays a very vital role in many cities across the world. And by privileging the formal of the informal, you overlook their role. For example, in Indonesia, in Solo City, if my memory serves me right, they wanted to build a new bus rapid transport system. So they hired a team of German engineers who came and developed and installed the system over a few years and marginalized the existing system of these local minivans. Over a couple of years, they realized that ridership on the BRT system was extremely low. And that was primarily because of low connectivity to the nodes of the BRT. And that was primarily because these informal transport systems had fallen into disrepair as they had been ignored by the government and sidelined. And therefore, they actually brought back this informal system to provide this last mile connectivity to the BRT. So these are some functional challenges. There are also some structural challenges as well, right? If you focus on formal plans, there are issues of equity there. Ananya Roy has a remarkable case study on how a focus on formal planning can accentuate gender inequities. For instance, by giving land titles that might be part of formal planning processes, they usually go to an elder male in the household. That further marginalizes the place of women. And overall, one of the structural challenges is that these formal plans rely on an expert worldview as opposed to the lived experience of people in cities. So they marginalize a particular kind of knowledge and privilege another kind of knowledge. And therefore, we argue in the book that we need to shift towards embracing informality with a much greater degree of earnestness than we currently do. And we specifically identify three kinds of links with the informal city. We argue that planners must embrace informal knowledge, informal actors, and informal practices. And again, instead of it just being a pie in the sky, we give tangible examples of how this might be happening in different parts of the world. I think an excellent example of embracing informal knowledge comes from Slum Dwellers International, where their self-enumeration exercises that have taken place in many countries across the world have delivered unique policy impacts by ensuring that slum dwellers make themselves seen to formal planners. And I was reading about some, I'm sure there are others on the call who know this firsthand, but I was reading about some remarkable policy impact that this has had. For instance, in one country, a self-enumeration exercise led to an understanding of how many more people live in a slum settlement that was marked for demolition and eviction. And then the government suddenly realized that they had not planned for resettling so many people. So they actually stopped that demolition exercise. So we need to draw on these, on informal knowledge and bring that into the formal planning system. The second thing is about embracing informal actors. And I think there is a growing discourse on bringing barefoot planners and architects into the fold. This whole idea of barefoot planners and architects stems from a pre-existing discourse on barefoot doctors, particularly in China. These were semi-trained, quasi-professional medical practitioners that was the only way in which the China, with its burgeoning population and growing health needs, could help provide medical services in the hinterland and in rural areas. And now we are seeing that even in planning processes, people are embracing these semi-formal actors. And there are lots of examples of this. In Swaziland, for instance, a slum that was earmarked for redevelopment in an atmosphere that was typified by a great amount of distrust between slum dwellers and city authorities. The city authorities actually decided on recruiting a set of people from the local communities to act as intermediaries between the slum dwellers and city authorities to broker trust, to communicate priorities, which then led to a much more effective and less fractious slum redevelopment process than it would have if it was a top-down process without the engagement of these intermediaries. And similar use of barefoot planners and architects has taken place in China, in Cape Town, and in different places across the world. Which then brings us to the last recommendation, which is on embracing informal practices. And again, there are lots of examples of this. After the Gujarat earthquake in the early 2000s, when hundreds of buildings across the state were demolished, the state and local NGOs sensibly realized that its rebuilding effort is not going to be led by engineers in hard hats and high visibility vests. It's going to be led by informal guilds of artisans and builders. So what they did was provided training in resilient building techniques to these informal builders and artisans, developed a federation of them so people wanting to rebuild their houses could access them more effectively. Again, bridging the informal and formal in innovative ways. So our thrust here is it is foolhardy to imagine that you're going to deliver resilience at scale just by mainstreaming resilience in formal planning processes. You need to acknowledge the high degree of informality that exists in some of the most vulnerable cities across the world and bridge the gap between the informal and formal. Which brings us to my penultimate section of this presentation, which is on urban systems. And in this, we argue that we need to shift from a focus on hard infrastructure for building resilience in these systems to more soft infrastructure, which is training and capacity development. Again, like with the previous three components, we started out by mapping the state of play. We tried to understand how are people currently building the resilience of key urban systems, be it water, energy, transport, or health. And again, there were a few things that came across. When it comes to water, people are either managing demand, managing supply, or strengthening infrastructure. A good example of this comes from California, where the government has mandated the reduction of the width of shower heads, which has led to saving 38 billion gallons of water over a 10-year period, as an example of demand reduction. Again, when it comes to energy, pretty much the same thing. Either there's a focus on reducing demand, increasing supply, or strengthening infrastructure. A good example of this is the proliferation of smart grids, which help divert energy from demand surplus areas, from supply surplus areas to demand surplus areas. And the third urban system is transport, again, where we looked at what people are doing, and people are doing a couple of things, either climate proofing transport systems or enhancing the robustness of rails and bridges and roads. And a good example of this comes from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where they're building a new metro rail system. And as the city is highly prone to flooding, they've come up with all kinds of new technology to waterproof the mechanical and electrical parts of the system. And the final system that we looked at was health, where there is a sharp emphasis on early warning systems, particularly for hazards such as heat in cities like Paris and Ahmedabad, and also climate proofing health infrastructure, where you can make sure that clinics and hospitals can withstand floods and cyclones, etc. So overall, a very sharp emphasis on hard infrastructure. And I don't just take my word for it. We looked at some hard data. We looked at all the money that has gone from the Global Environmental Facility, a very important climate adaptation fund, to cities. And we found that only 2.6% of it goes into activities that can purely be defined as capacity building, with the rest going into infrastructural development. The other big challenge in the sharp focus on infrastructural system is lack of attention to residual risk. Simply put, residual risk is the risk that remains after you develop the infrastructural systems to withstand certain kinds of shocks and stresses. This was most visible in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. The flood protective infrastructure around New Orleans was built to withstand a 1 in 100-year event, whereas Hurricane Katrina was a 1 in 400-year event. So once infrastructure fails, you need to rely on the capability of people running critical urban systems to ensure that the city can survive. Overall, we argue that there is a lack of attention to resilience capacities in urban areas. And we demonstrate in the book that cities particularly lack authority, awareness, and the ability to take action. Again, don't take my word for it. We all know that cities have fractured decentralization, where cities might be able to elect their own mayor, but don't have control over their budgets, which are, as the purse strings, are many times controlled by the provincial capital. In a recent survey of 350 cities, only 53% acknowledged or professed to having some understanding of how climate change is impacting them. And only 4% had a person or a team to build resilience. So big deficits here. And so in the book, we argue that you need to enhance the authority, awareness, and ability of cities to take action across the individual, organizational, and institutional scale. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be very selective in the examples that I provide here. In New Jersey, they ensured that the terms of reference of key professionals like directors of the Department for Environment and Conservation have the mandate to enhance resilience. So this gives them the capacity to convene cross-sectoral meetings of people to build resilience at the urban scale. I think there are now different examples from across the world how water utilities are training their people to manage systems adaptively. A good example of this comes from California, where one water utility issues water use guidelines on a weekly basis in times of emergency, as they have to ensure certain levels in the aquifer while also making sure that people have a minimum amount of water that they can use. This system of constantly tracking how much water there is in the aquifer and issuing guidelines on its use is a way of managing scarce resources in times of upheaval, which needs to proliferate across the world. And a good example of institutional incentives for risk reduction comes from India itself, where as part of the complex formula through which the center shares resources with states, recently they have added risk reduction in that formula. So states that demonstrate risk reduction will get a greater share of central resources. Which brings me to the final chapter today, which is on finance. And here our thesis is simple, that there is far too much emphasis on international, multilateral, bilateral resources for building resilience, whereas we need to pivot towards more endogenous resources. And again, we started by mapping what the current state of play is. Currently, cities have access to a few different kinds of resources. They have municipal revenues. These are under severe strain. They have governmental transfers, but these are scarce and earmarked. And there are some private resources, but cities are unable to leverage these effectively because of poor credit worthiness. And therefore, there is a reliance on funding from World Bank, Asian Development Bank, USAID, other bilateral funds, particularly in least developed countries, less so for India. But these are small and sporadic, and as we saw in the previous component, largely focused on infrastructural development. And this is because of a few different reasons. One is there are capacity gaps and financial constraints. Cities have limited capacity to develop proposals and leverage financing from different varied sources. There is a lack of information and data on how climate change might be impacting the city, which makes it difficult to develop cost-benefit analyses and leverage additional resources. There are lots of institutional and political challenges all of you would be aware of more than me. There are patron-client networks that poses a barrier to earnest resilience building. There is insufficient fiscal authority. I remember speaking to a planner in Indore, and he was telling me that you guys can come here and talk to us about resilience till the cows come home, but I don't have authority over my budgets. I can't allocate anything for resilience building. All that authority resides with Bhopal. So there are these challenges there. And then there are clear political challenges where political actors at the city level feel like, building resilience is about investing precious time and resources now for some unforeseen benefit, maybe after the next election. And conversely, there are lots of incentives for rebuilding bridges and roads after disasters. And I think, therefore, we argue that we need to make some clear changes to enhance the ability of cities to access the right resources. We need to build an enabling environment. We need to have the right legal, institutional, and policy regimes in place to overcome these challenges. Now, the World Bank, for instance, has a city resilience program, which helps cities develop these institutional systems to leverage resources. We need to develop new mechanisms of engaging the private sector. Surat is a good example of this through the development of the Surat Climate Change Trust that helped pool in resources from the private sector to engage in interesting resilience building initiatives. There's some question on the sustainability of this trust, but it did yield benefit for a particular amount of time. And then there are some other innovative finance models, such as green municipal bonds that have been employed by cities like Cape Town. And in India, there is no legal or legislative hurdle for cities raising money through municipal bonds. There is a lack of capacity to develop these and then to invest them in resilience building actions. We need to invest in risk insurance, innovative land value capture schemes, and also developing new and interesting cost benefit analyses that help you leverage additional resources. Overall, across these different shifts that we identify across the 5 components, our argument is that we need to complement these existing approaches. We need to understand that there are political economy considerations, and it's not only a technical and technocratic agenda. And we need to ensure that we're working systemically and systematically. With that, I'll stop now with apologies for taking 5 minutes over the time I was allocated, and hand back to you for the question and answer session.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya sir. It was quite intriguing and very informative. So often we end up, while looking into urban research methodologies, we end up following the method which are there in existing in current studies or the ones which are already being done. But we often fail to investigate those methods before starting our research in any field for that matter. And this entire presentation of yours was kind of checklist into what exactly we need to, look into and cross question the existing methodology in order to be more accurate or more confident about whatever we are, approaching toward. And the examples which you spoke about, the big data, that is very interesting. That one mobile phone that which is available, like which is like lying here and there, but we know they've never considered that okay, that can be used for such a important or crucial purpose also. So that was very interesting. Like how we can, there are things around us which we can implement to use in a better way to make as a source for information. So yeah, thank you very much for like this very important talk. I would like to here invite for the questions. Anybody has any questions? Kindly put it in the chat box, or you can directly ask also. Yeah, I would like to add one more thing. So when we are talking about informal setting in the like, how do we include informal sector into the planning process? Like the comment which you made on the formal planning processes, we often tend to give a one fits all approach. We have been taught for it. Like we have been doing that all the while. So like, what should we do in that context? Like what will be your suggestion on that? Like how do we?
Sure.
Because
So I think, yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks, Kalpita. Just to answer that question quickly, I think we identified three strategies specifically. One is we argue that we need to ensure that informal knowledge is included in formal planning processes. At the moment, many planners don't have a clear visibility in what's going on in informal settlements that have that occupy such a large part of some of our cities. And therefore, certain experiments that have been undertaken, not experiments, certain models that have been developed by institutions such as Slum Dwellers International, where they have a standardized and structured process through which slum dwellers survey themselves and make this very rich data available to formal planners to include in the planning process is one way of doing it. And I hope Sheila ji is still on the phone with us. She's led a lot of this work, so I presume she can provide a little more rich detail in this. But apart from that, I also argue that we need to make sure that informal actors and people from slum settlements themselves need to be part of the committees and teams and processes that are developing new plans. And there are examples of this from countries across the world that we can draw on. And finally, there are informal practices like acknowledging that most of our cities are not being developed by formal builders, but by informal builders and artisans. And so training them and providing them, including them in, as part of city development processes is vitally important. Sheila ji, I don't know if you want to jump in and add to this.
Maybe let them ask you more questions, because
sure,
I'm much more accessible to this lot than you are.
Sure.
Hi, Kalpita, can I ask?
Yes, sure.
That was excellent presentation. Sheila keeps talking about a lot of issues, and we are yet to see much greater details. My question is very basic. I think very often we talk about climate change and resilience. People use the word in the time of climate change, and it's like in the time of COVID, and COVID will come and go. Climate will not come and go. This is going to stay. I mean, I feel there is a perception kind of about the way when we talk about climate change. Across. I mean, come across many people talking in a similar language, and I feel the idea of climate change needs to be discussed at very grassroots level, right from, like, for example, architecture in the first year, or maybe, I don't know, becomes a very basic kind of things at the early stage. So we kind of adapt to things. I just wanted to know your views on that.
Yeah, I think, Manoj, you're absolutely right. I think, yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with you. I think we are seeing positive moves incrementally for a much greater degree of awareness at the grassroots level as well. Now, many times in my experience, people are aware of climate impacts, but don't speak the language of climate change. For instance, when I was doing field work in Gorakhpur a few years ago, people would talk about कि यहाँ पर पानी ज़्यादा आ रहा है, यहाँ पर बारिश ज़्यादा हो रही है, गर्मी ज़्यादा पड़ रही है, but they would not say this is Jalvayu Parivartan, this is climate change. So I think there is that issue that exists there. But yes, of course, I think we need a multi-pronged approach to raising awareness. I think we need to ensure that more curriculum is developed, particularly at the primary and secondary school level on climate change. And then further on, we need to make sure that the media is playing a much more helpful role in climate change. I mean, I think by and large, there is a massive increase in media attention on climate change issues. I mean, I was very pleasantly surprised around COP26, the amount of drawing room conversations in our cities that took place during COP26 around what's happening there in Glasgow, and conversations that were taking place in the media as well. So I'm quite hopeful that this will increase.
Thank you.
Aditya, Kalpita, I'll ask a question. Aditya, you speak of this whole aspect of value capture. In the last slide, I was looking at this whole notion of value capture. But most of what we look at in our Indian cities is the value capture. The whole approach is primarily towards the private sector. They capture the value of land. So I just want your viewpoint. Have you got any examples where the governments could benefit from this whole idea of value capture, and that then being invested into resilience or resilience building activities?
Yes, absolutely. In the book, we have examples from a few cities across the world. Primarily, I have to admit that a lot of the land value capture schemes, from which the proceeds of which have been invested in resilience, at the moment come from the global north. And I think there's a scarcity of land value capture schemes that have delivered resilience in the south. But we demonstrate that we can draw on these to make sure it happens, because we're seeing, as you rightly said, we're seeing land value capture happen in different ways, including, for instance, Delhi-Mumbai corridor, right? A lot of that is focused on land value capture, but it's not being invested in resilience building. So we provide some examples of how it can be.
Can I ask a question?
Please, Ainsley, sure.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think it's a fantastic presentation, and the book covers several aspects of it for anyone to learn. The thing is, you started off with this idea about big data. Now, the problem with the informal sector is that we don't have any of this big data in the global south. And the pace of urbanization or development is moving so quickly that by the time we capture this data, the ground realities have transformed. Any ideas about how this can be addressed?
Thank you very much. So again, I want to caveat my answer by saying that I don't think big data is a silver bullet. I think insights from it need to be melded with other more traditional approaches of understanding risk. But to answer your question more directly, I beg to differ slightly. I think one is there is an incredibly high amount of smartphone penetration in cities particularly. And smartphones are only one of several sources of big data on risk. For instance, in Mexico, they've used point of sales machines as one approach to understanding cyclone preparedness. Very simply put, they're trying to understand who is buying what in cities that are about to face cyclones, so that ahead of the next cyclone, they know which parts of the city are able to stock up and prepare for cyclones. And in places like Jakarta, they've used Twitter in informal parts, informal settlements, as a way of crowdsourcing dynamic, rapidly changing information on flooding patterns. So I think lots of interesting things are happening around this big data paradigm. But I worry that a lot of us, this global community of practice working on urban resilience, isn't alive to the opportunities that big data provides, and also, of course, not adequately alive to its challenges, of which there needs to be a much greater appreciation as well.
Yeah, we have one question in chat box by Professor Binti Singh. So she is asking, in what duration did you complete the study? How many people were involved to carry out primary level research? And can you discuss the entire process of the research you undertook for the benefit of urban scholars like us?
Sure. So this only draws on secondary data. We did not do any primary data collection. So when you read the book, it's effectively analytical, systematic literature review organized in 5 key issue areas where we make a argument. It took me and my co-author about a year to actually write the book, for about 3 or 4 years, from beginning to end, from conceptualization to the book proposal stage, etc. I was lucky enough to secure a fellowship, which gave me one clear year without having to work, where I could dedicate to writing this book.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have one hand raised also.
Yeah, for that,
Yes,
because
Sangeeta.
students know. Thank you, Aditya, for that elucidation, because students need to know the importance of a literature review, and that from a robust literature review, you can actually produce a book. So many congratulations. It's a wonderful work and very, very helpful insights for us. And we are also struggling with this. These questions are same, but we are really grappling with the methods as to how to arrive at, even at the start of some responses which could in some way, address the issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gandhiji.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, Jamshed. I can hear you.
Yeah, it was a very academically appropriate presentation for people who are associated with resilience study. I have a couple of questions. I have one question. We presently doing a resilience study with Mumbai's flooding systems and we do have difficulty in getting high resolution satellite maps to help us as your understanding of big data. However, I won't bother you with that one. I'd like to understand for a city like Mumbai, where you talk about participatory methods to be, usually we find it's a top-down method where administrators take decisions like pumping water out and not being able to understand the smaller aspects of disasters in some sense. How is it that communities can help in? Are there specific examples, specifically in context of Bombay, that can help go about dealing with such situations?
Sure, Jamshid. I think I'm not exactly sure about an example from Bombay, but I'll give you an example from the Gorakhpur that I mentioned earlier that I think would be relevant here. I think here, again, this is the same problem that Gorakhpur was facing. There was top-down decision making on how to deal with low-level, high-frequency flooding. So the Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, which some of you may know, which is a highly credible NGO working in East UP, they decided to take a different approach, where in some of the worst affected areas of Gorakhpur, they organized slum-level committees and developed a leadership structure for these committees that met regularly to discuss the problem of flooding. And they developed a knowledge management system through which insights developed through participatory meetings were communicated to the municipal corporation. And they were communicated specifically through a city level resilience committee that the NGO had built. Now, they brought together in this committee representatives of slum dwellers who were affected by flooding, municipal officials, universities, private sector players. And in this way, they built this bridge between the city authorities and informal settlers. And this is just one tiny example of how participatory approaches have been used in cities across the world. And I know Spark, for instance, has done a lot of this work on bridging the formal and the informal, making the voices of poor and vulnerable urban citizens heard, employing participatory approaches. But it does require patience. It does require intermediaries like civil society organizations, or even local universities or educational institutions to play this catalytic role of organizing communities so insights can be collated, funneled, discussed, and implemented.
Thank you.
Jamshed, can I come in here? I think it's very interesting that we need Aditya to have this conversation. But the reality is that in many, many neighborhoods, like Aditya said, there's a direct relationship between poorly managed solid waste that goes into drainage and produces the, the regular floods which are there. But these floods get exacerbated when there are huge rains and we have this phenomena of our pumps not being able to push out water in high things. So one of the things that would be interesting for us to do together would be to do this at each ward level, because in Mumbai, it is the ward that addresses the issues of drainage, sewage, and uh, solid waste. And so we first deal with that level, because you know that in Mumbai, the municipal corporation starts clearing canals and drainage areas for pre-monsoons only in April. We want to start doing it in January. So if we do this in one ward, where we actually find out all the places where there is flooding. Most young people in our neighborhoods now have smartphones. They can geotag areas which get flooded. So we should look at it like this. But what it requires is a multi-year relationship, because then uh, together you can actually produce impact that makes it a new routine. So we've done this in many other cities as well, where we've used communities and their ability to produce local data to work with us to do it at city level. So maybe
Very
this
relevant.
can be this
Yeah, very
possible.
relevant. I find the idea of the ward very, very appropriate. I think even during COVID times, I think the
Yeah.
municipal commissioner addressed the entire COVID pandemic using the wards to decentralize data and work with that, and that has worked well. And you're right, there are certain wards that face these problems more intensely than most wards, and perhaps youth, if they can become more participatory by at least by way of observance and communication, I think it's the way out. Thank you for the next.
So I think we can actually explore this together and see what we can produce as a simple protocol for different communities to provide this information in, say, a couple of like east, west, and South Bombay wards. And I think it's an important time to do it, because it's for the first time that ward officials have been given so much responsibility because of COVID. So if we maintain that and we push for that, it works well. The other thing I feel, uh, uh, Aditya, which uh, we would like to do a lot with KRVI in the area of climate, is how do you incorporate the knowledge about the impact of climate change on the choices you make on every single thing you do in architecture and planning. You know, it's not like it's a separate subject. It's like, you know, it's
Right.
like you just like when you design something, now it's become very, very clear that the structural integrity of whatever you design has to be incorporated right from the beginning. So if you are able to develop a curriculum which constantly looks at the climate dimensions on different forms, it's already a big step forward. So Manoj, one more work for you.
Yeah, this is well said, Sheila. This is what we are, exactly what I'm trying to find a way to introduce right from the first year of architecture.
We're all
Yeah, and
here if you need any help.
we also, as for our master's course, entire course was based on the theme of resilience. So our faculty is also working on it, like how this resilience framework can be worked out for southern part of the world. I think we have more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. I'm sorry if there is a feedback because I'm sitting right where the recording is happening. Sorry for that, Aditya. But I think it was a fairly insightful presentation. You managed to capture an entire book, the essence of it in so many words, and that was fairly insightful for us. My question was essentially based on this idea of green infrastructure. We did see that as a main component in one of the sections that you were talking about. From our experience of working with Indian cities, we generally see that there is an inhibition, when it comes to moving the shift from the grey to the green. While when we speak of the effects of climate change, I believe as a landscape architect and an academician who's been kind of touching the surface of resilience. I mean, I won't even say I'm an expert on it or anything, but I believe that there should be more conversations regarding the use of green infrastructure, the green blue. You've been working with many communities, many government organizations around the world. In your experience, what are the learnings that we could possibly kind of take from there? I mean, have there been a major shift, or is it the same around the world?
No, I'm glad you asked this question, Sandeep. Thank you. I think there is starting to be a major shift in the use of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based solutions for reducing climate risk in cities across the world. And I think there is these are starting to demonstrate impact at scale. I think the biggest learning is in terms of making headway for convincing policymakers is by demonstrating the core benefits of green and blue infrastructure. I think we are looking at it now purely from the perspective of climate risk, but in the time of COVID, for instance, green infrastructure has demonstrated tremendous amounts of value in, apart from keeping citizens sane by giving them places where they could go out outdoors during times of COVID and enjoy the outdoors in a socially distant way. Implications for pollution, which is not necessarily linked to climate change, for noise pollution, for light pollution, all these issues that are making our cities more unlivable, green infrastructure helps ameliorate and balance them. So I think bringing together the economic benefits, the climate benefits, the well-being benefits, and the environmental benefits of green and blue infrastructure, it's what is leading to progress. Now, having said that, I have to also be honest about the fact that I'm a bit confused about green infrastructure, particularly in cities of the global south. While it is a fantastic concept, I have no problem with it in theory. My worry is every time we talk about green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, we are talking about reclaiming land for natural purposes, which is almost inevitably being occupied by people living in slums. So there is a big trade-off when we talk about green infrastructure in cities, because land is limited, and where they want to build a new a natural reserve or protect an ecosystem or resuscitate a river, it means relocating informal settlers more times than not, which is a problem that I have in a blind belief on green infrastructure, especially in countries of the global south. Yes, in Sweden and Norway, it's fine. You can do that and you'll still get good equitable impacts.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you so much, sir, for your time, and we are surely looking forward for more dialogues in future, because this course is going to be there. Like resilience is the new way out in urban sector. So yeah, thank you so much again.
Great. Again,
Yeah.
thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It's a delight to be with you.
Thanks, Aditya. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Sheila.
May I go to OBS?